All right. Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today we have a special treat. We have a returning guest, someone who's been on the show before, John Loken. Hey, John.
Hi there, Dale.
Welcome back. Welcome back.
Thank you
And
very much.
no problem. And I'm really excited about today's topic. Obviously, we're just a couple weeks after Easter and that sort of thing. And last time John was on the show, he mentioned he wanted to come on and talk about his theory about the resurrection, how to explain it in his book. The Shroud Was the Resurrection, as you can see there. So that's sort of the plan for today. But just before we get into some of the topics, I want to turn it straight over to you for anyone who didn't see the previous show with you. Do you want to kind of introduce us as to who you are and a bit about your background there?
Yes, thank you very much, Dale. First of all, I should tell you thanks for having me back on. You were a gracious host last time, back in November 2022. And you were very brave to invite me, I must say. I rarely get such invitations. My position is rather unusual, of course. And I must congratulate you on your knowledge of the Shroud and many other things too. I wasn't very aware of your blog before. I think it's been going, what, 2 or 3 years, something like that?
Yeah, 2019 is when I started it. So.
Right. And there are so many things online anymore about the Shroud. So, anyways, congratulations on that. Um, some general information about myself, perhaps. Let's see, I'm not a sciencey kind of guy. I studied the humanities in college, got 2 degrees, history and literature. Um, I've been an agnostic since about the age of 30, back in the 1980s. So that's my general position. Have remained agnostic for some 35 years. Started studying the Turin Shroud seriously about 20 years ago. And I had I quickly came to the realization, in my opinion, that it was authentic. It was the burial shroud, actually, of Jesus in the first century. And then I had a sudden insight as to the meaning of it and wound up writing a book about it called The Shroud Was the Resurrection. It came out in 2006. The idea being that the image of Jesus formed naturally in the tomb, and it was ghostly, it was serene, it was inexplicable, and it inspired his followers to believe in his miraculous resurrection, um, with the additional help of an empty tomb, and we can get into that later on. So the two factors, the empty tomb, missing body, and the image on the shroud, were the origin of the resurrection belief. Um, Unfortunately, the book's been ignored by almost everyone. Both sides of the issue have ignored it. The supernaturalists, except for the great Dale Glover, have ignored it, and also the liberal New Testament scholars have ignored it as well. Of course, they are those who disbelieve in religious relics in general, and they disbelieve in the empty tomb story, and they are
They're
not.
even, I was just going to say, they're even skeptical of that these days. Like Bart Ehrman's changed his mind on the empty tomb. But yeah, sorry to interrupt. So.
Exactly. So I find myself in the middle, and it's kind of a lonely little position to be in, a rather chilly feeling at times. Um, it's a tiny little club, very solitary. Maybe Thomas de Wesselo also is in that group. He published a book in 2012 called The Sign, proposing the same basic theory with some different details. But otherwise, not much interest. It was a small time production, so it's not very well known out there. And also, I participated in a Shroud Turin Shroud forum for a number of years, on and off. So today, I sort of requested you that I could talk a little bit about the last program, make some corrections and comments and so on, and then move on to my book and to Thomas de Wesselo's book and try to compare them for the sake of your viewers. So First, though, I might just make some general remarks about religion, very brief and not terribly organized, but I am an agnostic, but I'm not anti-religion, except for its extreme forms. Uh, and I'm not anti-spirituality. I realize it's a part of human nature. It will always be with us. Life is chaotic and confusing. It is sometimes cold and cruel. And so people have a need for hope and reassurance, and they find religion, they find that in religion. Also, if they don't find it in religion, in the belief in God or gods or the divine, they tend, human beings tend to gravitate toward an anti religious extreme, which is very troubling. And for example, you find the absolutizing of the self in recent decades in our modern society. Um, Today's rampant identity politics, I'm not a fan of that at all. And in the 20th century, of course, we saw the ideology of communism, which was an atheist ideology, and its tens of millions of victims, murder victims. So I realized the enormous danger of being anti-religious. So me, I'm more of a centrist. And by the way, many agnostics are rather centrist themselves. It's a misconception that to be agnostic is to be liberal or leftist automatically. I do have a few liberal and leftist beliefs, but in general, I'm more of a centrist, and most or many agnostics are in that center group. There are even quite a number of conservative, politically conservative people who are agnostics. So now,
Yeah.
moving on, one problem with the shroud field, as you know very well, Dale, is the overeagerness of shroud authenticity supporters and also shroud authenticity skeptics. They tend to see either the shroud everywhere or they see it nowhere at all. And I've gotten carried away myself at times with small issues and questions. So we all have to guard against those extremes. One recent case, go ahead.
Oh, no, no problem. I think if you're going where I was thinking you're going, I just kind of wanted to interject and ask you because a lot of I'm doing a show tomorrow about the shroud in the Bible, and are there mentions of the shroud in the Bible? So I don't know if that's where you were. Is that where you were about to go, or?
It was actually. I was thinking in particular right now, for the moment, just spending a minute or two on the question of the Apostle Paul's letter to the Galatians. It's gotten a lot of interest in recent years. Verse 3.1 in the Galatians has made many people think that it's an actual allusion to the Shroud of Turin. And it seems to be a growing movement within the shroud field. I actually studied it starting back about 3 or 4 years ago. And in my view, it is not an allusion to the shroud. What it does, 3.1, for those who don't know it, it says, I believe, before your eyes, Jesus Christ was presented crucified. Now, that does sound remarkably like the Shroud of Turin. However, it's only 7 little words in Greek, and what we don't have there is any reference to a cloth or to a body or to a face. And also the phrase Jesus Christ is very, very common in Paul, in his letters. It's a typical Pauline expression. And also crucified, that's very important for Paul. It actually occurs 3 or 4 other times in the letter of Galatians itself. So it's very common in his epistle or letter to the Romans. It's the same way. He very frequently, I think 30 times, refers to Jesus Christ with the combination of crucified or dead or dying, that sort of thing. And then the eyes, it's not necessarily physically meant, literally meant. Okay, the Bible apparently contains some 478 references or uses of the word eyes, and many of them are figurative. They're not literal references. So there's that. And the Greek phrase in Paul's epistle does not say before your own eyes or before your very eyes. Some English translations render it that way, but that's actually not correct. And of course, the people who believe that Paul's Galatians 3.1 refers to the Turin Shroud, they tend to emphasize that translation, but it's not in the Greek. So, and then to wrap it up, there are major geographical objections to the idea that Paul or Peter or any early Christian leader carried the shroud around with him through Asia Minor, Anatolia, and went to visit the fledgling Christian communities in Galatia. And if you think about it, he would have been risking storms and high seas and bandits and robbers and thieves and even curious animals, all of whom could have damaged, destroyed, stolen the shroud. So in my opinion, at least, that is not a reference to the Turin Shroud. Moving on now, you gave permission for me to discuss a few viewer comments that were written after our video on November 3rd, 2020.
And just so the audience knows, so basically in that November show, I was bringing on John as a non-religious agnostic or just agnostic, whatever you prefer. But as you can tell from what he said already, he is pro-Shroud in terms of the historical question of it being authentic to Jesus. So that's what that show was about. So yeah, John, kind of take it away. I know you got some comments from some in the audience that you kind of wanted to respond to, as well as to yourself. So yeah,
just briefly, maybe 5, 6, 7 minutes. Let's see. Some of them were very nice and were welcome, even if they weren't nice. So I thank those people for those. Maybe some of those people are watching right now. Others were a little problematic. And I'd suggest to people in the future, please try to write correctly. There was a lot of misspelling and a lot of grammar mistakes. Punctuation was a little weird. And so please think before you write. Otherwise, it gets rather messy and confusing. And also your points will go lost if I cannot understand them. Just keep that in mind in general. Also, elsewhere on the internet, it's too easy to.
I'll just throw in here. So John, he's a stickler. He's scolded me as well on the at Shroud Science Group about my grammar and stuff. So yeah, don't be offended. He's just a prop. He wants to see the proper grammar and stuff like that.
And awesome. I appreciate your understanding, Dale.
Of course,
that's great. Thanks very much. So let's see here. Paul, a writer or a viewer named Paul, was thinking that I did not believe in the empty tomb story. Actually, I do believe in the empty tomb story. The question for me is only why it was empty, why the tomb was empty. I favor a natural explanation. Happens to be a body theft, specifically with the Jerusalem authorities engineering it. Chapter 1 of my book, a long one, focuses on that question, and we'll discuss it later on in more detail. James was another viewer. Frankly, I didn't understand what he was writing. Again, problem of communication. So, James, if you're out there, try harder. Good luck. John F., he wrote about Italian scientists being authorities. And I would say, well, yes, and maybe not so much. They are excellent in some ways, many ways, but Italians can also be somewhat biased. Catholicism in Italy is very, very strong, and it affects even scientific judgments. So, but in general, I agree with John, that John F., that more testing needs to be done on the shroud, or not even on the shroud, but more experiments without the shroud need to be done. So Rich B, he has a serious spelling problem, I believe. In content, again, I would say that far too few experiments have been conducted, imaging experiments, trying to replicate the natural um, image formation. Also, Rich claimed at one point that he said, of course, the collapsed cloth is not going to be mentioned in a 2,000-year-old document. Now, that's an illogical claim to me. I would say almost the opposite. I would say that if the followers of Jesus found the cloth lying flat on the stone burial bench in the tomb, uh, there's a very good chance, probability even, that they would have mentioned it in the Gospels, because, of course, that would be an indication that the body had disappeared from underneath the cloth, the shroud. So I find it rather odd that they don't mention it. Okay, the two Gospels, Luke and John, all they say is the linens, the burial linens, were lying there. That's all they say, and that's very important. Now, over the centuries, Christian theologians interpreting the Gospels have been trying to read into it a flat or undisturbed or collapsed condition. So that was my point I was trying to make. Some early Christian theologians actually described the linens as a cocoon. The body had disappeared and left the shape of the body. And of course, that's going way beyond what the actual Gospels say. So that was my point. Another one, Anthony wrote a very interesting comment. There was no distortion of the image, and therefore that the cloth was flat when the image formed. And he wondered how that could possibly have happened naturally. Wouldn't the drape of the cloth have distorted the image? That's a very good point. And I've puzzled over that myself too. The image seems to be so perfect that one wonders how a natural formation could have created it.
You do affirm, just for the audience, you do affirm that the vertical alignment of the body images type feature, right?
Yes, I was just about to get into that. You anticipated my thought. Yeah, very good. We're on the same wavelength there.
Awesome.
So I was about to make 2 points. Apparently, it's not, the image is not so completely undistorted. There are small distortions in the image. If you go on shroud.com, there are a number of articles that have been written on that question. Also, several Christian shroud scientists over the decades have proposed the idea, and Dale, you must have heard of it too, that there were objects laying beside the body or laid beside the body, which propped up, supported the top sheet of the shroud. For example, small sacks of spices, and they needed only have been maybe 10 inches high or so in order to have created a relatively flat plane over with the cloth lying over the body. And of course, in the Gospel of John, people have pointed out that there are very clear references to a lot of spices, 100 weight, I believe it's called. So that's another point in favor of some sort of flattening, but a natural flattening of the shroud cloth before and during the image formation process. Unfortunately, it's all a scientific question, and I really can't go any further. I wish I could, but almost finished with this section now. Jason made a point that he too liked the writings of Alan Watts, and I thank him for that. I'm glad he appreciated Alan Watts's books. I remember reading Behold the Spirit 40 years ago or so. And then let's see, moving on, a few.
Oops. All right. I guess he kicked himself out. Hopefully he'll rejoin in a second. All right. So what do we just while he's trying to rejoin. So we got the God Talk is saying that is indeed still kind of an open question for me, how the linen was laid out to receive the radiation. Yeah, and obviously with John, he's an agnostic. He doesn't believe in the radiation hypothesis and that sort of stuff. So he's kind of like Barry Schwartz. He's using those spice bundles or spice packs. Okay, so John's back. Hey, John, you're back. We can't hear you.
Is it better?
Yep, you're
Okay.
back.
Very
It's
good.
awesome. All right, cool. So yeah, pick up. I think you were just finishing off your response to the comments, and then on the last show, and you also had you wanted to respond to some comments that you yourself made in that show.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, let's plunge into those right now. I made a few comments that were not entirely accurate. Also, too many ums and ahs. Apologies for that. The Jaspis imprint, I mentioned that as being a cloth which was imprinted with the image of a hand and arm and back of a hospital patient in England. And I said it was the 1970s, actually 1981. And for people who are interested, they can check that out on shroud.com. Jaspis is Jospice. Also, I mispronounced a couple of words, few words, French, how it is. The Maillard reaction, I should have said, I called it Maillard, I'm sorry, for the image formation. I've studied a lot of different languages over the years, so I get them confused sometimes. Anyways, forgive me there. I mentioned, too, the so-called pipette method for applying the blood onto the shroud in the medieval artisan scenario. The skeptics of authenticity have mentioned this pipette as a way. They clearly did it to avoid the problem of the complete lack of brush strokes on the shroud, both in the body image and also the blood stains. There are no brush strokes. So how do you get around that? Well, one proposal was the pipette method, which is a little straw. Dale, when I mentioned that, you and I did not believe that was possible. Too cumbersome and awkward. And when I mentioned it, you said that you had not heard of that, and you thought that maybe it was an old theory which had been refuted. And I just wanted to clarify that it was actually proposed just 2 years ago online. Just 2 years ago in a Shroud forum by a well-known authenticity skeptic. So it's not an old one, and it's not really been completely refuted, although I did contradict it at that time, and I think sufficiently so, because I haven't heard anything more about that pipette method. So there's that. Let's see. And also, I don't believe there's any record of a pipette having been used in medieval art. So that's another factor to consider. Last November, I mentioned, too, the empty tomb angels in all four Gospels, and my long-held belief that they are a garbled or disguised form of the Turin shroud. In my 2006 book, I mentioned the angels 7 or 8 times at various points, and at least a few other people have also held that belief. In 2012, Thomas de Wesselo, in his book, he spends a few pages on that subject. I believe pages 241 and 42, if people have that book handy. He goes into more detail about it. And interestingly, I dug up in my cavernous archives, I dug up my old chapter that never made it into my book on the tomb angels. So it's a memento of some 17 or 18 years ago, but there it is, my chapter, and it's about 10 or 12 pages long. So I was very keen on it.
If you are willing, and feel free to say no, but if you want, you can send that to me and I can post that chapter up on my blog for people if you want. But
that's a thought. Yeah, it still needs a bit of polish. I noticed there are a lot of words crossed out and others added, so I need to
Okay.
polish it. But thank you very much, Dale. Thanks.
No worries.
Let's see. It's now basically a memento of days of yore that are no more. Um, let's see. The human blood question, whether the blood on the shroud is human or undetermined, is very important. We talked about that in November. Uh, I'm of the mind that it's definitely real blood, but others have said that, and recently too, in 2022, even I believe I read it somewhere in 2023, someone saying that it's actually human blood or that it's human type AB blood.
Mm.
So uh, I was going from the information provided by Kelly Kersh, a well-known and excellent researcher in questions of the shroud's blood, and I still believe he is correct. But these others in the field, they have other ideas. It would be really nice if there were more consensus on that issue. Maybe it can be achieved someday, and maybe in the next conference that issue could be focused on. Or you yourself, Dale, you might like to do a special program on that blood issue and just try to achieve some consensus on it. So there's that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've got it's coming up. I've got a future panel review show where we're going to be addressing that for sure. But yeah,
Very, very nice. Great to hear. That's great to hear.
Yeah.
Also, the question of the nakedness of Jesus on the Turin shroud. Last time we spoke, Dale, that question arose as possible evidence for authenticity. And you mentioned at the time that a certain shroud authenticity skeptic, no name maybe, is
You
needed.
it's okay. He doesn't mind.
Let's see. He said that Jesus was very often shown naked in medieval paintings. So last November, I didn't know much about that subject. I couldn't respond very well. Since then, I've looked into it, and it turns out that the claim is, well, a little bit of a fib, shall we say. It's a little exaggerated. That skeptic, he confuses the issue by bringing in Adam and Eve in medieval painting, okay? And they are actually irrelevant, okay? Adam and Eve were, of course, lowly sinners, and they're just not comparable to Jesus Christ, the God-man. So it's really irrelevant. And besides that, the paintings of Adam and Eve are mostly, almost all of them, rather small ones. They're not life-size by any means. And then the skeptic, he refers to the Jesus in his nativity scenes, which again, it's a far-fetched comparison. I mean, really, he's just a baby there. So, there's nothing at all risque about it. Let's see. He then went on to claim that Jesus is almost always shown naked in his baptism scenes at the River Jordan with John the Baptist. That's actually not true. Anyone could go on Google Images and look, just look under Jesus baptism medieval, and you'll find 100, maybe 200 images of medieval paintings showing Jesus. And at least half of the time, he is wearing a loincloth or even a flowing robe, okay? And besides those, another, 20, 30% of the time, he's shown, or maybe even 40%, he's shown submerged in water. He's waist deep, and the water is blue or is green. So it's very discreet depiction. Maybe a forearm will be placed in front. And then there are, maybe, I would admit, maybe 5% of the medieval paintings of his baptism do show him technically naked, but he has no privates. Okay, they're just sort of airbrushed out. They're not there. And besides that, they're very small paintings in general. They're tiny. Jesus is 10 inches high, 12 inches. What's that? 20, 25 centimeters. So now, finally, before we get to my book, I'm not sure how Oh, we're doing all right. Yeah.
Yeah. And before you get into your book, I'll let you finish your thought. But we do have two audience questions related to what you were saying about the shroud. So do you mind if I just ask you those before we get to your book?
Absolutely. Yeah. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Cool. Okay. All right. Cool. So this one is about where you got cut off, where you're talking about the flattening of the cloth. So this is from the God Talk. He was saying, look, it is indeed, even for supernaturalists, it's an open question. How is the linen laid out in terms of receiving the radiation? Whether it was stretched out or somewhat involved in enveloping the body or the corpse. Um, so yeah, I guess I just wanted to get your take on that. Like, even if you do take a supernaturalist perspective, couldn't there be some kind of flattening or something like that still involved? Or
Yes. I really, when I referred to it a few minutes ago, that's about the limit of my uh, ability to speak on that flattening. Okay.
okay,
Um, I've read it discussed in the Shroud forums in the past, but not being a scientist, I really can't contribute anything. Uh, all I know is that quite a number of scientists on these Shroud forums have mentioned the possibility of objects of some sort next to the body propping up the top sheet. Okay, so and again, the image is not apparently not completely perfect. There are signs of wrinkles and distortions in it. So um, it's hard to say that it was completely supernatural. If it were a supernatural image, um, I would think personally that it would be perfect. It would be 100% perfect. Um, So I can't really answer that question. It's a very good one. I'm sorry, I can't go any further into it. In a way, it's funny, but the Turin Shroud, it's a mystery. Of course, it's a great mystery, maybe the greatest mystery of all history.
I agree.
And in fact, it's such a mystery that I think sometimes it doesn't even exist. I don't. I think it it doesn't even exist because it cannot possibly be a medieval creation. It cannot possibly be, in my mind and other agnostics, it cannot possibly be supernatural, and it also does not seem to be, for certain people, a natural formation. So you've got these three main and really only three options, and they all seem to fail in one regard or another. So
Gotcha.
sort of jokingly, I would say the Turin Shroud does not exist. But the problem is, of course, it does exist. So we've got to figure out which of those choices are maybe the least problematic. Okay, you have another question?
Yep, this is the last one, and then I'll let you continue. But so this one is from the Vulture, and he says, "I have a question. Does the fact that the shroud is not easily explained, as you were just kind of saying, as either a forgery or a natural phenomenon, strike you as interesting? If it were man made, wouldn't it be explained by now? We would expect to have an explanation. I think is what he's getting at. So,
Uh,
what's your
I think I understand. Let's see. This writer seems to be very skeptical of the medieval shroud creation. Is that how you read it, Dave? Dale?
Yeah, he's a Christian, and he's kind of saying, look, if it wasn't supernaturally created, we should have the explanation, whatever it is. We should know how it was made. That's what I think he's
Oh, I
asking.
see. I see now the natural phenomenon. Yeah, I see that too. You would think so, but again, although it's been investigated for quite a while now, especially since the 1970s, there remains a lot to be done. A lot to be done. There have been no new experiments done on the shroud since 1978. That's a long time ago, 45 years ago, and uh, of course, it's being held back by the Catholic Church for their own reasons. Um, but that could well open up a whole new area of inquiry and results too. We could know more about the natural phenomenon, possible natural phenomenon of the shroud image. I think there haven't been very many experiments done at all trying to replicate it as a natural phenomenon. A couple of names come to mind. Nitowski, I believe she conducted some experiments in caves in Jerusalem many years ago. Also, Rodante comes to mind, Italian researcher. He did the same thing in caves in Sicily. But apart from those two, I can't really think of many others. And I really wish that some more people would sponsor and conduct experiments trying to replicate a natural formation. I hope that answers that person's question.
Awesome. Yeah, cool. Well, yeah, I think that covers it for now. So yeah, I want to turn it over to you for the most important part here. Here's where we're getting to your book, which provides your theory on the resurrection and
Sure.
how the shroud ties into that. So take it away for the next half an hour to 40 minutes or so.
Sure, absolutely. All right. My book came out in 2006, and then DeWesselo's book, The Sign, it came out in 2012. Both of our books suggest that the image of Jesus on the shroud formed naturally. And we both propose that the image then inspired the resurrection belief of Jesus' followers. So our major points are very much in alignment. So there's a lot of overlap there. But there are some differences too. So I thought I might summarize them for your viewers, compare them. Mostly minor, but nevertheless interesting. I think some of your viewers are familiar with DeWesselo's book because it was much better known, and may not be familiar with mine. And so the comparison may help them in that regard too. So my book, it's very short, 176 pages. I only have a few illustrations in it, about 10 altogether, black and white, all of them. It was a lone wolf product. I had almost no help in writing it, and did have 2 or 3 trusty proofreaders. Very grateful for them, to them, but they were mainly acquaintances. It was sort of a rushed project. It was all done in space of a year, a little bit over a year. I did not rehash the whole history of the shroud or reputed history of it. I figured that had been done often enough before in so many other books. I also did not go into the scientific results or claims, forensic issues. So I spend basically just a paragraph or 2 in the preface discussing scientific claims or facts. And I'm sorry to say, but some of them are mistaken. At the time, I was using books written in the 80s and 90s, and some of the claims made in those books were a little exaggerated. And so don't don't trust me entirely on those points. But again, it's a couple of paragraphs. I focus almost entirely on the first Easter weekend, Good Friday, Saturday, and Easter Sunday, and what happened in Jerusalem and around the tomb during those 3 days. So I do accept the tomb as being empty, but as mentioned before, I believe strongly that it was due to a body theft organized by the Jerusalem authorities in order to prevent any tomb veneration, to prevent the tomb becoming a shrine for Jesus in the future, and also to prevent any violent demonstration at the site. So I think the best, their thought was that the best way to prevent those things was to remove the body. Let's see what else here. I spend a long chapter on that, chapter 1, by the way. Let's see. I haven't, since then, read any valid criticisms of the book. Again, I've had almost no response. People just go silent. and on both sides they go silent, both camps. So it's a little mysterious. I did acknowledge my partial predecessors very early in the book too, and already in the preface. I have a long 35-page chapter on the face cloth of Jesus, which is mentioned in the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 7, I believe it is, the so-called sudarion, and make a lot of references to the sudarium of Oviedo, which you've talked about on your show many times probably, which I do still believe is authentic as well. It was put on the head of Jesus outside the tomb, not inside, but outside. What else here? I should mention it. The book is on Amazon now, but it's priced way too high. I'm not responsible for that. Amazon's algorithms they calculate and so on, and I would not get any of that price. I'll try to contact them soon. Meanwhile, if anyone would like to read the preface to the book, I could send them a digital copy of that. If you write me at lokenj@hotmail.com, I'll get that to you. So now, in comparison with my book, de Wesselow's The Sign, it's a very long book, 450 pages long. I've got a copy here. I'll show you one copy. Looks like that. Okay. And he got a lot of help. He had a big publisher, a whole team of assistants, editors, and it's really superbly well packaged. He discusses the entire history of the Turin Shroud. He also goes into depth into the artistic evidence and the forensic evidence. He doesn't use much Greek, and his theory, one of his unique theories, is that the body was still in the tomb when the women followers went to the tomb, and then the shroud was taken from the tomb and the body was left behind. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. De Wesselow also took several years to write his book, and it shows. It's very well written, excellent style, and so on. He doesn't mention the Sudarium of Oviedo much at all. He does speculate quite a bit about the Apostle Paul and his possible role in the shroud interpretation. What else? It's been given some consideration by liberal New Testament scholars in academia, and I would say it deserves even more consideration and attention. I hope more people will read that, both New Testament scholars and also people in the shroud field. I first read The Sign in 2019, just a few years ago. I was too busy until then, or maybe too lazy, but I liked it very much. I found it excellent. Of course, it's a very familiar theory to me, so there's a lot of overlap in our interpretations. In terms of my book, again, I'm not familiar with any serious criticisms of it, apart from the fact that the natural image formation has not been reproduced in modern times. That's a valid criticism. But again, I mentioned so few experiments have been done on the shroud since 1978. That has been a factor. De Wesselow, at one point in his book, he writes that my stolen body theory is unnecessary. He has his own, as I mentioned just now. That's a mild criticism. I don't take it as a sharp criticism, rather a mild one. And I still think it's not a valid one. He also uses the term body snatching at one point, which tends to make it sound a little melodramatic, like a fiction, a thriller, a novel. In fact, however, body stealing, corpse stealing, or desecrating of dead bodies has been fairly common throughout history, either for for medical research purposes or for some political or religious claims involving rivalries and political power struggles. One thinks of the situation in Sophocles' tragedy Antigone, involving King Creon and the corpse of Polynices. Also, we can think of all the tombs of the Egyptian pharaohs, which were, of course, plundered. They were raided by grave robbers, King Tut being almost the only exception. In the book, I also explore the honorable burial given the body of Jesus by Joseph of Arimathea. And I find it very revealing. And I pointed out that it was from the point of view of the religious authorities in Jerusalem, it was actually an offensively honorable burial, a provocatively honorable burial. And we don't get that view in the Gospels, but it's important to keep in mind. They would have understandably have been outraged by that honorable burial and wanted to do something about it. So let me just catch a little drink here.
No problem.
Let's see where, somewhere around here.
No worries. I've been making notes as you go to ask you some probing questions once you've laid out your case. So yeah, take your time.
So thanks.
No worries.
Nice. The best drink in the world. All right. Water.
H2O, God's own recipe, right? So
there you are. Very good. So let's see. Am I lost here in my thoughts? No. Let's see. Moving on. I also explore the story of the tomb guards whose role in the entombment seems very suspicious to me. I ask myself, what was their real purpose? Was it really to guard the tomb? And if not, what else? And to me, it seems to point very strongly in the direction of assisting in a body theft. I've even done on one page in my book, in chapter 1, I did a demythologization, if that's the word, of the passage which refers to the tomb guards. It's about a paragraph long. And if you delete all of the miracles and supernatural aspect of it, you get quite a revealing picture of what the tomb guards were actually up to. Or if there were no tomb guards at all, which many New Testament scholars claim, then it would have been all the more easy for the authorities and their henchmen, their underlings, to remove the body of Jesus. And we need to remember it was done at night. Whatever happened in the tomb, whatever happened, resurrection or body theft, it was done at night. There was no one there watching it, checking. So, Dale, you may or may not be familiar with the name of Yasser Arafat. Yasser Arafat, right? You're a relative youngster, so he was very much in the news back in the late 20th century. He was the leader of the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization. He died in 2004. There was a huge controversy at the time when he died, and the controversy was as to where his body would be buried. He personally and his followers wanted it to be buried in Jerusalem. However, and to make a shrine of it there, the Israelis understandably did not want a big shrine to Arafat in Jerusalem. And so finally it was Ramallah was chosen, a smaller city. But the controversy was in the news for several days, and it just shows you how important that issue of the location of a tomb can be. And I can see that same thing happening 2,000 years ago with the case of the body of Jesus. More recently, there was the case of Osama bin Laden, taken out by a commando team about 10 years ago, I think. And what did they do with his body? They did not leave it there in Pakistan because they knew that his followers would make a shrine and put the body in it, and it would be a rallying point for militant Muslims in years to come. So what did they do? They actually removed the body from that house and from Pakistan, flew it out to sea, and deposited it in an anonymous burial. So those two cases are just a couple of many others that I could cite as backup evidence for the body removal back in the first century in Jerusalem of Jesus' body. So let's see. Some skeptics of my stolen body theory have protested that if the Jerusalem authorities had stolen the body, or I should say taken the body of Jesus, they could have produced it to refute the claim of Christians that Jesus had been resurrected. And in my book, I show that that's rather a weak argument. They may, having done this act already, they may very possibly have destroyed the body immediately. It's known that the authorities there in Jerusalem did resort to fire or lime on occasion, or sometimes to destroy bodies of criminals. So that could have happened. Also, simple natural decay would have obliterated the remains of Jesus within several months. And that's another factor to consider. Apparently in Acts, the Acts of the Apostles, there is reference to the authorities there also simply beating the Christians into submission in those early years. So they did not need to go to the length of producing the body. And besides doing so, if they possibly could have done so, it would have been an admission of their own guilt in removing the body. So that gets rather complicated, of course. Another little pause, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no problem. One thing, I guess I'll just, because I've got a lot of questions, I'll just throw in one quick question here if it's okay. So that's one thing that I liked about your book. You went into a lot of detail as to different options as to who would have stolen the body, why you think it wouldn't be them, but it would be the Jewish authorities. Here's one criticism that I was immediate to me when I was reading your book.
Sure.
Okay, if it was the Jewish authorities, why on God's green earth would they accommodate the prior provable prophecies of Jesus and steal it on the third day? It seems unlikely that the Jewish authorities would steal it to make it look like a prophecy fulfillment of Jesus. So what's your take on something like that?
Right. Very good question. Very good. And I actually do cover that in the book, maybe too briefly, maybe you missed it, but 2 or 3 spots in the book, I mentioned that. And actually, the fact is that although in, I think it's perhaps Mark, there is a reference to Jesus prophesying his resurrection after 3 days, there's no earlier mention of that until the Gospels were written, starting around the year 70, okay? In the so-called Q document, which is not extant today, but it was determined by New Testament scholars that it did exist back in the first century. It was called Q, an abbreviation, and it contains many sayings of Jesus, and it dated from the 40s and 50s of the first century, very early, before the Gospels were written. Many of Jesus' parables are in there, and the Beatitudes and so on. But in all of that material, there's no mention of a resurrection of Jesus. So that's one criticism of the idea, belief that he actually prophesied his own resurrection. Also in the First Corinthians of Paul, the letter First Corinthians chapter 15, the early verses there, he mentions that the resurrection of Jesus was foretold, but he doesn't say by Jesus himself. What he does is he said, as it was foretold in Scripture. So, and he doesn't get specific as to what he's referring to, but scholars in general, they've realized that Paul was referring to things like Jonah surviving supposedly 3 days in the belly of the great fish, okay, the whale, and a couple of other rather vague references to some sort of resurrection. So there's a complete lack of any evidence, any claim, I should say, that Jesus prophesied his own resurrection up until the first gospel was written. That's a 40-year period. So that's my answer to your question now.
Awesome. Perfect. Yeah, thanks. Continue on your case, and I'll ask my other questions at the end. So
excellent. Very good. My own biggest question about de Wesselo's, the sign that involves his treatment of the tomb of Jesus, which, as mentioned, he thinks was not empty, that the body remained in it. And his explanation is, I believe it's on page 244 of his book. The women followers, when they came to the tomb, they saw the stone still blocking the entrance to the tomb. And de Wesselo says in a very brief sentence, he says that they pushed it aside. All right. Now, that's quite a scenario. The women, we can imagine, they were not very strong, and to push this huge boulder aside would have been quite a task for them. So I find that a rather weak scenario to me. And also, he says then that they went inside, they saw the shroud image when they were in the process of anointing him, and then they or possibly the disciples removed the shroud. And again, that claim is made in just a brief single sentence, and it's not detailed at all. And I find myself trying to envision the process of their removing the shroud from the body, and I find it very difficult to believe that they would have, to get the bottom half of the shroud away from the body, they would literally have had to turn the body over, and then tug the shroud out from under the body and yank it out. And I just can't, I suppose it is plausible, but to me it seems a bit far-fetched. It would have been undignified behavior, sacrilegious even. There was their rabbi, their beloved rabbi, in front of them, dead, and his body showed all the pains of his crucifixion, according to this scenario. And for them to have done something like that just because they saw a faint image on his shroud seems to me very, very unlikely. So that's my criticism of de Wesselo on that point. A couple of other points, and then I'll finish up. Let's see. Also, the timeline for such a major change in the story to have taken place, I find it very, very short. It must have happened, if it did happen that way, within just 2 or 3 decades. And many of the followers of Jesus were still alive in the 40s, in the 50s, and in the 60s. So for them to have changed their story so radically and made the tomb go from full or containing the body of Jesus to not containing the body of Jesus being an empty tomb and due to a resurrection, to me, that sounds rather far-fetched. For one thing, the Apostle Paul, of course, he knew Paul very well. The Apostle Luke, he knew Paul very well in the 50s and gathered a lot of information from him about about the beginnings of the faith. And Luke mentions the empty tomb both in his gospel and in the Acts of the Apostles. So all of that evidence supports, for me at least, it supports the conclusion that there was an empty tomb. I also doubt de Weslow's suggestions that the Turin shroud was shown widely around Palestine in public displays. He tries to explain Paul's claim in 1 Corinthians that it was that 500 brethren saw the risen Christ. And de Westlow thinks that what they saw was the shroud itself in a public display and its image. Personally, I think Paul's claim was more fantasy. It really wasn't, it was just an exaggeration. He was writing to the Corinthians who were 800 miles away from Jerusalem, and they couldn't check on his claims. So that's my take on those issues. In general, though, I would have to say that The Sign seems to me an excellent book in most regards, and I would highly recommend it. So.
All right, awesome. So, all right, so that's very interesting then as a theory. It's something that I think is kind of unique to you and de Westlow. It's definitely not a mainstream skeptical theory that's said all the time. You know, the resurrection. How do we explain it? The appearances where the shroud, seeing the shroud images and that sort of thing. So, okay, well, one thing a few questions I want to ask you, and we do have a couple of audience questions on this. First question for you is kind of supportive of your notion that there is in fact an empty tomb, but I'm just wondering, N.T. Wright's sort of argumentation that the appearances plus the empty tomb were both those elements were necessary in order to give rise to the resurrection belief. I know that you're familiar with N.T. Wright from your book and stuff, but what do you make of N.T. Wright's argument? I know it's something that Hugh Ferry, for example, even as a shroud skeptic, has paid homage to in arguing for the resurrection. Do you think that's a good reason to believe that there must have been an empty tomb as well?
Dale, I didn't quite follow everything you said. Were you using the appearances as evidence for the resurrection?
So N.T. Wright, he argues, how do we explain resurrection belief in the early church? And he would say, well, the appearances and the empty tomb, you need both of those. If you just had the appearances, it wouldn't give rise to the resurrection. If you just had an empty tomb but no appearances, that wouldn't give rise. So I just wanted to know, what do you make of that?
Yes, I would agree with that too. Yeah, I think if if there was no empty tomb, you just had the appearance stories, that wouldn't be strong enough in itself. And of course, just an empty tomb alone would point actually more than anything toward a body theft. So that wouldn't suffice. But when you started to have the appearance stories crop up, then the two factors together, they really created a certain dynamic, and the resurrection belief then took off. It took off. In the early years, it appears that in the letters, there are 21 letters in the New Testament, epistles, about half of them do not even mention the resurrection of Jesus. They deal with other matters entirely. And of the other half that do, almost always what they refer to is a resurrection up to the right hand of God. Okay. And scholars have noticed for decades now, maybe a century or more, that it's described as it's declared as an ascension to God the Father, and not described as an earthly resurrection, walking and talking and eating with the disciples. That all comes later. In Paul's 1 Corinthians letter, chapter 15, there is, I believe it's the one and only reference in all 21 epistles of the New Testament to the appearance of Jesus after his resurrection. But that's all it says. It's just he appeared. He appeared to Peter. He appeared to the 12. He appeared, and so on. So to me, it's rather a vague. It's a vague declaration of his resurrection, not at all like the later stories. And of course, in every legend, there are additions made in time, and things get more vivid and they change and so on. So that's my understanding. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah. No, it was good. I just wanted to get your take. So, all right, cool. One thing I just wanted to follow up on the question I asked you, and you sort of gave your answer regarding the resurrection prediction. No, I'm just. Are you familiar with Mike Lokona, a biblical scholar who's he's given 6 independent arguments that prove Jesus did historically predict the resurrection? Are you familiar with those arguments at all? Or
I know his name, and I may have read some of his writings back a long time ago, back 17, 18 years ago, but I've forgotten them if I did read them. But go ahead if you like. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'll just give some examples. So, for example, he'll apply the criteria of authenticity, right? So, there's one where it's a prediction of Jesus' death and vindication or resurrection, where he's talking to the apostle Peter, and first he says, "Who do you think I am?" And then, okay, he answers rightly, and he says, "Good job." And then,
yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
But then he scolds Peter. So because Peter says something wrong when he makes this prediction and stuff like that, surely that won't happen. And he says, "Get behind me, Satan." So this fulfills the criterion of embarrassment. And this is one of the reasons Mike Lokona will go, well, this little kerygma is probably historical. Jesus probably actually said this. So that's just an example. But yeah, if you're not familiar with the arguments, but do you think that, what's your case about historians trying to say there are certain predictions we can have reasons to believe are historical and in general?
Right. I'd really have to investigate it, look at those texts, and also see what New Testament scholars have written about them. One thing that occurs to me just off the top of my head is that passage is in one of the Gospels, right? It's in Mark or Matthew.
Yeah.
And again, the Gospels are a combination of history and fiction, both. And they were began to be written down some 40 years after the death of Jesus. And, the order was probably, scholars think probably it was Mark first, followed by Matthew, followed by Luke, followed by John. Little 10-year intervals between them, roughly. So I just don't know how valid that evidence taken from one of the Gospels would be to the question of Jesus having predicted his own resurrection. That's my...
Just a quick follow-up and a general question because one of your areas of expertise is in history. So do you think what certain the scholars in historiography call the criteria of authenticity, they are valid in terms of allowing us to say this part of a text probably is historical versus other parts we don't know? Or do you see any role for the criteria of authenticity to play a role? Or
I have not studied that formally, but I mean, any ancient text is obviously suspect for a number of reasons, and you have to sift very carefully words and sentences that may be true and those which are dubious, very questionable. So
Gotcha. Cool. All right. Cool. So, kind of moving on. Another question about the empty tomb. This will be the last one on the empty tomb. But I just wanted to. So I found it interesting. You did kind of work with the story of the guard. A lot of skeptics would just kind of dismiss that part as a legend, but you go with it. And one thing I wanted to ask about is, okay, if the Jewish authorities and the temple guard were the ones responsible for stealing the body, what about the Roman seal and the Roman involvement? Because they would have been in trouble with the Romans. So obviously, you would have to say the Romans were in on this as well. Otherwise, the Jewish authorities would be in trouble for breaking that seal. So, what's your take on something like that?
Right. Good. Very good question. And I do cover that maybe too briefly in the book. My theory is that it could have been either party to organize the removal of Jesus' body from the tomb. I tend to think that the religious authorities were the ones who did it for the most part, but perhaps with the compliance of the Roman authorities. In other words, they informed the Romans what they were going to do, and the Romans said, okay, that sounds fine. We understand your reasons. Go ahead with it. Okay. So there may have been a cooperation there, collaboration. It's possible. It's possible too that the Romans alone did it. They, having held power, they were the major power there in the city, that they performed the removal. It's also possible that the religious authorities, the Sanhedrin, did it alone. I just don't know. So I keep that question open. It's not really crucial. The other evidence for such a removal seems stronger than trying to pinpoint exactly who did it. You've got the nighttime setting or timing of the removal, the missing stone or the stone moved to one side, which is very suspicious, and so on, other points as well. And that offensively honorable burial of the body by Joseph of Arimathea, I can see that would really have outraged the authorities there.
Gotcha. All right, cool. All right, so just a couple last questions from me, and then
Sure.
we do have some audience questions as well. So,
Very good.
okay, so kind of turning, you mentioned 1 Corinthians 15, so that's something I'm glad about. It's something.
Yeah,
Oh,
I mentioned what?
1 Corinthians 15,
Yes.
and as you know, so this is not just Paul writing this. This is a creed that even atheist biblical scholars will admit go back within months to maybe at 3 years or something after the events of the resurrection. So I don't want to get too specific and stuff, but there have been arguments by various biblical scholars that from that creed, it's not as vague in terms of the appearances. Sure, it doesn't give us details about touching or eating, but we can tell that it's speaking of a bodily appearance. From that creed, that's what it's talking about. So it's not some ghost-like appearance or an ascension. So do you think that the creed is useful in any way in terms of specifying and proving that, well, maybe the shroud wouldn't work? It's talking about a bodily resurrection, and they're seeing this body kind of, it goes to sleep and then it arises up, kind of thing. So it's talking about the body. Images on a shroud wouldn't qualify. Yeah, what's your take on that?
Well, I understand your point and the point of the scholars that you are citing. But to me, that section of 1 Corinthians, it just remains very vague. The word used repeatedly, it's only one word. It's almost, in a way, it's almost monotonous. Jesus appeared, and he appeared, and he appeared, and he appeared. I think 4 or 5 times it's said, and there's just a total lack of any other description of, movement, walking and talking. The same word, I believe, in terms of Greek grammar, it can also be understood as he was seen. Okay. So that's a very interesting nuance there. It's not just that he did the appearing, but that he, as an object, was seen by these people, Peter and the 12 and so on. And of course, that gets very, very, very close to the shroud image.
Awesome.
So,
Awesome. All right, cool. Well, last question from me on this, and it's again related to the appearances. But when I was reading your book, and maybe I missed it again, but when I was reading, I didn't see anything in your book about this. So there's this notion. Okay, what is it? There are qualifying criteria to be an apostle, right? You had to have seen the risen Jesus. You had to have had this appearance. This was one of the requirements. Now, if your theory is true that okay, the resurrection appearances are explained by seeing the shroud, um, why did the resurrection appearances ever stop then? Like, why did it stop after Paul? Shouldn't they have kept showing the shroud? Like, what accounts for that decisive stop after Paul? Jesus stopped appearing. People see him in visions, but they never have an appearance of Jesus again.
yeah, that's a question I've never really asked myself. I think I don't know why they would have stopped. Of course, the secrecy factor. Um, I believe that it was a dangerous thing to show too many people the shroud image.
Mm.
Uh, you know, loose lips sink ships, as they say in wartime. And if you start talking around the fact of this image, you're going to get people being too curious about it and wanting to see it, people who really shouldn't be looking at it. And before you know it, they're going to turn around and go to the authorities. And the authorities are going to come looking for it, and they're going to confiscate it and very possibly destroy it. So that would be one reason for the sightings and resurrection appearances to sort of die out. Also, there just weren't. There's not much to go on since, in my view, since there was no actual resurrection, these stories couldn't continue. Jesus simply wasn't around to be reported on by hundreds and hundreds of people. So I should say too, the resurrection appearances, and I may make this point in the book, they're almost all, if not all, they're rather subdued and secretive. You don't have any case of him walking, striding up on the walls of Jerusalem, or up out in public among the populace there. They're all rather secretive, and that again indicates to me that there's something unusual going on, and it's consistent with private showings of the shroud. In the upper room, for example, in Luke and John, you have this upper room scene where he appears to them, and his words are very simple. It's just, I believe, he says peace and then a few other words. To me, that's very consistent with a showing of the shroud in an upper room. Two of the disciples would have held it up vertically, and the others would have beheld this wonderful visionary experience of their dear rabbi who was gone now, and it would have been just amazingly inspiring. So.
Okay. Well, I know I promised that was my last question, but this is the last one, if you don't mind. But that that raises a very interesting issue. This was another thing I was thinking about as I was reading your book and stuff like that. But okay, again, pretending your theory is true that the shroud images equal the appearances and these private showings, how that doesn't seem likely to convince people like Paul or James, who were skeptics at the time. I mean, just seeing the shroud images, you've seen them. It doesn't convince you, or many skeptics have seen the images. So, how would you account for people who were skeptics, or in Paul's case, even anti-Christianity, anti-Jesus at the time? Why would they convert just off seeing shroud images?
Right. Uh, I don't really go into that question much in the book. I limit my focus almost entirely to the 3 days of the Easter weekend, the first Easter weekend. And of course, Paul came into the scene some years after that. I don't believe he converted until maybe 3 years, 2 or 3 years after the crucifixion. His case, and I don't necessarily think that he knew about the shroud. He may have learned at some point in his career. He was martyred when in the mid-50s, but it's just not certain where the shroud was during those years. And if he saw it, he may have heard about it, but not been shown the shroud, because he was always this, former enemy. And a lot of people may have had some reservations about him. So maybe they didn't show it to him, or if he saw it, maybe they didn't show the image on it for some reason. They just wanted to keep that part secret. It's all very, very speculative when it comes to Paul. So I veered away from that subject in my book. I do think that the main factor in his conversion was not actually the shroud image, but rather his guilt. A lot of people switch sides, either politically or in religious terms. They go from being entrenched on one side to a complete opposite stance because of some experience they have, conversion experience. It goes both ways. Former liberals become conservatives, and vice versa. And we know many examples. So that explains, I believe, Paul's case. I think it was more of an emotional, guilt-ridden conversion. In the case of James, he was apparently the brother of Jesus. So he had a family affection and affiliation there, which may have played a big role in his joining the movement. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, James was at first somewhat standoffish toward Jesus, but then he came and joined the movement, became the first bishop of Jerusalem. It's interesting, though, the Epistle of James in the New Testament, which it's not certain. It may very well have been written by him, or by him with the help of a polished writer who helped him with his Greek, or it may have been written by his immediate followers, using his ideas. And what it expresses very strongly is the original Jewish Christianity, the form of Jewish Christianity before Paul took it out to the Gentiles. And that whole Epistle of James is very concerned with ethical matters. Excuse me. Ethical questions and good behavior and this and that. He doesn't actually mention Jesus more than once or twice, and he does not mention the resurrection either. So, and that's rather revealing to my mind. So that's my take on those two examples. They are good examples for you to raise in terms of counter examples to my own evidence, but I believe that I can explain them in that way.
Awesome. All right, cool. So I'm going to go to a few audience questions. So I'll start with the vulture here. This is kind of a general question. Obviously, you are an agnostic, right? So he's saying, look, in all politeness, did you, John, say earlier that supernatural is not a viable explanation? And this could apply whether it's the shroud or to Jesus' resurrection in general. Yeah. If so, why did you say that?
Right. Well, I would say at this point, if I am going to claim that other people uh, are uh, what they are thinking fantasies, then I have to recognize that I myself may be believing fantasies too. So, so to that extent, I'm very sympathetic to the your commenter here. I could be fantasizing my naturalistic explanation as well. So, um, I'm not doctrinaire about my about a rejection of the supernatural. So that's a conditional stance. I must say, though, let's see. In terms of the Turin shroud itself, leaving aside, well, I think I did mention quite a few pieces of evidence to doubt the resurrection of Jesus. There's no prophecy of it in the Q document. The letters, the early letters in the New Testament, only half of them mention a resurrection, and it's always a declaration. It's not a description of it. So other things too. There's even a few passages in Matthew 28, for example, where Jesus, in the story, he's resurrected, he's on the mountain. But Matthew says, but many doubted, or but some doubted. So here you have an admission by a gospel writer that the resurrected Jesus himself could not persuade some, and you might read even many of the followers, that he was actually there. So to me, that's another cause for doubt. Let me turn, though, to the Turin shroud evidence itself.
One thing, just
Please.
as you answer that, one thing that I could add to this that might help it. What would it take for you to finally go? Yeah, actually, I do think that it was supernaturally explained, kind of thing. Like, yeah, maybe add that into your answer if you don't mind.
Yeah, do you mean the resurrection or the authenticity of the shroud?
Either or, yeah,
Or
like
the supernatural formation of the shroud image?
yeah. You're moving on to the shroud. So let's stick with the shroud. What would it take for you to be convinced?
Uh, that's an excellent question. Kind of leads into what I was about to say. Uh, I'll have to list the negative points to begin with. Okay, um, to begin with, the body is actually dead. Okay, the body of Jesus, as shown on the shroud, it's dead. There is no sign of a resurrection. It's the eyes are not open, although we only really know that since the 1898 photographs by Secondo Pia, which showed that his eyes were closed. Until that time, for all of the preceding centuries, the vague, shadowy image that was on the shroud, it actually looked like the eyes were open. So that gave people the impression that it was a resurrected Jesus. Also, the body, it's double imaged, which is rather odd. If it were, to me at least, if it were a supernatural product, I don't see any reason why a god would necessarily have produced a double image of the body. I would think that a frontal image alone would suffice to impress the followers with a resurrection. But instead, you have this weird and even awkward when you look at the shroud on uh, the image. When you look at the image on the shroud, you've got these two images, a double image. It's really redundant in a way. It clutters up, if I may say. Sorry to say it, but it actually sort of clutters up the image. It diminishes the frontal image by showing the back image. So now, in the world of physics, however, many of the forces and effects in physics work in a vertical way, a vertical direction. You yourself, I believe, earlier you mentioned the word collimation. That's been very frequently used by scientists in the shroud field. And those are natural forces. So again, the double image, to me at least, it speaks more for a natural formation. The body we mentioned before, it's naked. Again, if it were miraculous, the image were miraculous, I just don't see any reason why the body would be depicted naked. And that factor appears to have been one reason why the shroud was kept so secret for so many centuries. It wasn't even known. There were just a few references to the body being naked around the year 1000. So, yeah, in all the earlier time, it wasn't referred to. Obviously, it was not a welcome sight in ancient Jewish society. Also, I mentioned the factor of the distortions. There are some minor, maybe not major, but minor distortions on the shroud image. If it were a miracle, I would expect, at least probably, that the image would be a perfect one, and it's not quite perfect. So, also, one very interesting point I've made in the past is that it's not, how should I say this? The actual image formation process, whatever it was, is not what impresses people about the shroud image. What impresses everyone, mostly at least, when we look at it, it's the composure of Jesus. He looks very serene and a little ghostly and glowing with his hazy outline. And if he had been depicted in another posture, say a tortured posture, as you see in paintings of, say, the recumbent Christ, many paintings of the so-called recumbent Christ, you can find them on Google Images. And, in those, his head is often twisted to one side. One of his arms might be lying, stretched out. So he's in these awkward looking postures. If the shroud had shown those kind of postures of Jesus, it would not be as revered as it is today. And people, I believe, would tend to think more that it was a natural formation. The image was formed naturally. But instead, we have this wonderfully composed and serene posture of Jesus. His head is straight forward. He looks like he has conquered death, really conquered death. So that's another factor. Also, the Catholic Church was intimately involved in the dating in 1988 and made an enormous number of mistakes. Sad to say, they made an enormous number of mistakes, and many of us believe that the dating was a misdating. So I find it ironic if the shroud was actually a supernatural creation, and of all people, the Catholic Church was responsible for messing things up so badly. Somehow, I wonder if a God would actually permit that to happen. So,
gotcha. All right, cool. All right, so the next question is from Mr. Jetty, and it's kind of going back to the examples of the stolen body, right? So he's saying, look, all of the examples that you gave there, John, are of dishonorable men and thieves opening up graves. That doesn't really fit the profile of the disciples. Now, obviously, your theory is that the authorities stole it. So let's plug in the authorities there instead. And I think his question still works. Why would Caiaphas and the authorities defile themselves by stealing a human body? I mean, surely their word alone could have been good enough. I mean, they could have just lied or something like that, or something.
Could you repeat the last sentence or two, Dale?
Just to simplify it, like why on earth would the Jewish authorities defile themselves by getting wrapped up in stealing a corpse and making themselves unclean and all that?
Right. Yeah, good question. Let me briefly address the man who asked the question. And And as you said, I don't pinpoint the disciples as being the ones. I long ago eliminated the disciples as the people who removed the body. They were obviously very, very fearful for their lives in those few days, and they would not have undertaken such an enterprise as to try to remove the body for fear that they themselves might have been um, crucified or, tortured, severely punished. So really, it comes down, and it was not common grave robbers either, just people out for valuables, and it was not any animals that removed the body. So when you eliminate those parties, what remains in the end is the authorities, and it's a fascinating subject. I read dozens of books 20 years ago, trying to figure out the reasoning of New Testament scholars. And virtually nobody ever proposed the authorities as the ones to remove the body. And I just could not understand it. To me, it made perfect sense. The authorities, again, they were outraged in this scenario, my scenario. They were outraged by the honorable burial of this blasphemer, this rebel, Jesus, Yeshua, and not only the honorable burial, but it was right outside the city walls. So it was very close to holy Jerusalem. So I can see very well them organizing it. You mentioned Caiaphas possibly being personally involved. I don't envision that at all. I think that henchmen, underlings must have done the dirty work, gone into the tomb late at night, 3 a.m., 4 a.m., whenever, removed the body. And by the way, they would not have taken the shroud with them, which is why the shroud was then found in the tomb, as related in the Gospels of Luke and John. They would not have taken the shroud because it was very flimsy. It was not a suitable container for carrying the body in. Extremely thin, very narrow, just 3 feet, 1 meter wide. And if they had tried to carry the body would have fallen out. And if they had tried to keep the shroud with the body, they could have tripped over it. You know how that works with bed sheets and all. It was awkward, so they just left it there where it was. And they undoubtedly, if they did this, if this scenario is correct, they would have had some container with them already, a large leather sack, a large carpet to roll it up in, something of that sort. So I hope that answers the questions.
All right, awesome. All right, so the next one comes from Mr. Trousers, and he says, so I'll try to change it up a bit, but the Jews had crucified in order to kill off Jesus' new movement. Do you not think that if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, we would never have even heard of him, as his disciples would have melted away? So I think just to kind of add here, look, in Jewish history, there have been a lot of false Jewish messiahs who, once they got killed, their followers didn't proclaim the resurrection. And presumably those guys would have been buried in shrouds. What if it was naturally explained? Maybe why didn't they keep the images? Why is Jesus so unique that only he had the circumstances that led to resurrection belief, and none of the other Jewish Messiah claimants had this?
Right. Good question. Let's see. I'm not quite sure I understand the person who wrote this message. It's a little awkwardly phrased for me, but basically, well, he was a really remarkable man. There's no doubt about that at all. And so, aside from the factor of the shroud image, the astonishing factor there, he also had a charismatic power and a deep, deep ethical concern, which again, it shows so clearly in the Epistle of James. If you read the Epistle of James, and that concern must have kept his followers together and what just kept them going for some years. So I don't claim that the shroud image was the only factor in the survival of early Christianity. His personality was a very strong one, and his ideals were also strong. Anyone can read the Epistle of James and find them there. So,
all right, awesome. All right, cool. So last but not least, the last audience question, and I think you'll like this one. It's nice and simple, but on the Shroud of Turin, how on earth do you explain the carbon-14 dating results? If what you're saying is right, and the shroud goes back to Jesus and explains the resurrection, it was carbon dated to the medieval period. How do you explain that on your end, John?
right. I'm not a scientist. I've read a lot about the C14 test results, but I just really can't pretend to make any valid statements on that issue. I tend to believe that they are not correct, and probably a combination of contamination of some kind, which skewed the results, and then the people who ran the experiments, the carbon-14 experiments, they were looking to, cut edges. They wanted to simplify their results. So it was a combination of the actual material that was tested and their own interest. And let's be honest, it was rather self-interest. They wanted to make big names for themselves in the carbon testing field. So those two factors combining together resulted in misdating.
All right, awesome. So, yeah, that's it for the audience questions. I just want to say thank you so much for coming on. I hope that you felt you had your fair say in presenting this unique theory.
Yes, very much, Dale. Again, and I appreciate your patience with such a one as me. I know we are on different sides in this issue, but you've been, once again, a great and gracious host. So thank you.
No problem. My pleasure. I think that it's really important to engage with people with who we disagree with and stuff. And like I said, yours is a theory. I watch all the resurrection debates, atheists versus Christians. This is something that is not normally presented in resurrection debate. So I think it was important to get it out there, and whether I agree with it or not, have people consider the merits of the case. So yeah, awesome. All right, cool. Well, that's it. I think I've covered everything. Just so the audience knows, so tomorrow I actually have two shows, but Shroud related for you guys. I have a panel review show, and we're going to be having Larry Stolley on, who's a pro-Shroud expert, arguing he says that there are 4 texts in the New Testament that he says are hidden references to the Shroud of Turin. We kind of went over that with John a little bit on one of them, Galatians chapter 3, verse 1. But we're also bringing on secular biblical scholars, nothing to do with the Shroud in general, but Dr. Darrell Bach, he'll be arguing the Shroud skeptics case. So Hugh gets a break as the Shroud skeptic on this one. And Ben Witherington, he is pro-Shroud in general, but I don't know his take on the question of, does he think the New Testament actually speaks about the Shroud? So it'll be an interesting little discussion to find out if there are 4 references to the Shroud in the New Testament or not. So yeah, thanks everybody again, and have a great week.
Thank you.